Hi everyone, I'm Barkha Dutt and you are watching The Mojo Story, our independent digital platform. Welcome to the nail-biting finish to the US elections. It seems all but over except for the formal final announcement. The state of Georgia has flipped in the favor of Joe Biden, who is all set to
I
be
can't
the
hear
next
anything.
president of the United States of America. I'm hoping that all of you can hear me because I can hear some of our guests saying that they can't. We'll fix that, Dilip. Don't worry. Let's just introduce our guest today as we discuss a very, very interesting conversation. And that conversation is about Donald Trump. Something unprecedented actually took place today. The President of the United States of America was calling the election process a fraud. He was insisting that if legal votes, that's the phrase he used, if legal votes were counted, he would in fact be the next president. Major television networks tuned out of this press conference, one after the other. They said the president was lying. Now, there is a big lesson here for media all across the world, and we can't even imagine this happening in India. So, on the program today, we look at the last moments of the US election, Trump's insistence that it's been a fraud election, and how the media has actually responded, with TV networks saying the president is a liar and refusing to actually broadcast this. Let me introduce our guests one by one. Dilip Cherian is with us, Dilip Cherian, image and brand guru. And Dilip, I'm hoping that you can hear us. If you can't, we'll fix it. Okay, you can't hear us. We'll call you and we'll get that line to you fixed. Padma Sundarji is with us as well, veteran journalist, covered foreign policy for decades. We're also joined by Ashutosh. Ashutosh is a senior journalist. He's been a television channel editor. He's also been a politician, so he's seen life from both sides. And we're also joined by Anil Dharkar. Anil Dharkar is one of our senior most commentators and also the organizer of the Tata Literature Festival. Okay, as we get started, if one of our producers can call in to Dilip Cherian, I think what Dilip needs to do is actually take off his headphones, and then he should be able to hear us. And let's get started with the others in the meantime. Anil, your first thoughts, I'll play out that statement of Trump, but your first thoughts when you see that the president, arguably the world's most powerful man, can actually be tuned out by American television.
Well, quite deservedly so, of course. But as you were saying, I don't know. Many people are saying, could this ever happen in India? And the answer clearly is no. I mean, can you imagine the Indian head of state being blanked out in mid-sentence, and television channels saying that what the head of state is saying is false, is not true, we're cutting him off, and so on. I think this is a lesson to us about real democracy. It is a lesson to us about what freedom of the media actually does mean. That when even your head of state goes on public air and starts telling the untruth, starts giving out fake news, it is the duty of the media to cut him off and say so. And Barkha, this even before this happened, you know what happened on Twitter and Facebook and so on, where Twitter marked Trump's many of his messages, his Twitter messages, as misinformation very clearly. Again, here you are taking the president of the United States and telling the public that what he's saying is false, that it is fake. They also blanked out, I think Facebook banned one of his support groups, Steve Bannon, who was one of the leading figures in the administration. He's been banned actually for advocating violence. So, would it, I feel a sense of envy also, and admiration, and envy because I don't think we can do this. I don't think Twitter, Facebook, or anyone would do this in India. Would they do this in India? They'd be thrown out the next day from our country. So there is envy for US, at the same time admiration for their media.
I have to say that I feel the same envy. I think this is what a free press actually looks like. As a journalist in India who studied in the United States of America, did my journalism from there, I almost feel regret that I didn't stay back to work there, because I cannot imagine a television network who would tune out the prime minister or the president, irrespective of which political representation that they may be close to. We would just not do it. We would be so beholden to the authority that that office carries, Anil. We would be so in awe of it almost. And Ashutosh, you've been a television editor. Before I get Dilip to respond to this, do you think this could happen? Could this have happened when you were the editor of CNN IB in Hindi? Could you have cut out of the Prime Minister's press conference and said, "Jhoot bol raha hai"?
Now, I could have certainly cut out Mr. Manmohan Singh if he had been the Prime Minister at that point of time. But since I hadn't seen Mr. Modi as a Prime Minister and I was not there as an editor, so it's I can't say anything right now. See, but the issue is, it's not that the Indian Prime Minister has not spoken lies. He has spoken lies, and he has tell many lies during the interviews also. But none of those editors had the guts to say that, Mr. Prime Minister, this is not a fact. This is not factually correct. And in fact, many things. But what happened in USA is, if you look at, this is just not one of those incidents which has happened here. Since Mr. Donald Trump has taken over the presidency, especially the TV channels and the New York Times, the Washington Post has been coming out, and every time Mr. President has said something wrong, they have in fact made a very detailed study of his lies. And if you go to the New York Times, Google New York Times and the Washington Post, you will at least find documented more than 10,000 lies spoken by the president itself. So it's not the first time they are doing it. And if you remember, when the New York Times publisher Sulzberger Jr., he had an appointment with Mr. Donald Trump, and it was agreed that nothing will be leaked out. The minute Sulzberg came out, Mr. President has, as by habit, he tweeted. So once he has tweeted, the Sulzberg was told about it. He also came out with a press release and said, "I told Mr. President that you are divisive and you are dangerous for the democracy." Now imagine, can any publisher in India do something like that after meeting Mr. Modi? I forget about Mr. Modi, even meeting after Mr. Manmohan Singh or Narasimha Rao. No, you can't.
So my point would be that, you are saying, Ashutosh, that you would have cut out of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's press conferences. I actually don't think that would have happened. I think that in Indian media, there is some kind of built-in, almost trained, indoctrinated respect for the office. We tend to distinguish as journalists between the post and the person. Maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should, I don't know. I think that is the question. And let me take that to Dilip and then to Padma. I'm going to play out Donald Trump's statement. He kept insisting that the election is a fraud. Even networks that are partial to him, that are seen to support him, like Fox News. Fox News didn't cut out, but Fox News at the end of that said, this allegation is baseless. Whereas we in India, Dilip, unfortunately tend to practice a much more he said, she said kind of journalism, especially when it comes to high office, senior politicians, high offices. We quote them verbatim, and that's the kind of journalism we're trained to do. Do you think we were trained all wrong?
I think we were trained all wrong. We have far too much respect for what you just said a little while ago, for the authority of the office. Oh, we are hitting the dignity of the office. Forget politicians. The way they critique judgments of courts, and at the Supreme Court level, it is impossible and is not thinkable in India, except for a handful of critics who have the voice and the gumption to do this. Meaning testicular envy is the word that strikes me, except that it's sexist. But essentially, we have created largely for ourselves a media environment where we are not willing to stand up and speak truth to power while power is in the room.
Yeah. And why do you think that is? I think the question is why.
I think it's built into our society. It's built into our society. We are taught to respect, this whole business of, respect for your elder, respect for the, mahant, respect for the patwari, all kinds. So these are all built into you at a societal level. It's it's a bit of cultural programming where which comes from extremely hierarchical, caste-ridden, patriarchal kind of system, and we play to that tune all our lives.
So basically, Dilip, you're saying that journalists are like every other section of the society. We are culturally programmed to be respectful of power. But I would probe this a bit deeper. And Padma, let me take this to you. I think the big difference between the US media and the Indian media is that access in America cannot be cut off. You can't hear me, Padma? You can hear me. Access in America cannot in fact be cut off. Access is institutionally guaranteed. Just look at the language of the White House press conference. The president stands, the journalists sit. There is no basis, for example, to deny credentials to the US press corps based on who's critical of the president, who's not. Here in India, by contrast, you can no longer enter the Prime Minister's office or North Block or South Block unless, yes, those of us who are PIB accredited still can, but most others can't, not unless you have friends on the inside. So isn't access a big part of why journalists are so beholden to power?
Access is one thing, and I just wanted to add that even with PIB accreditation in the interim, it's not that easy to access those who are in the seats of power. What I'd like to say is I agree with everyone who's spoken so far, and what I'd like to say is that I think what we are, we do have certain democratic traits, if you like, but what we are overall and primarily is a regulated democracy. And I completely agree with Dilip about all this looking up to, people in authority and patriarchal attitudes and all that. The other thing is that, I think, Barkha, till we get rid of this greed and race for TRPs, and I think that is some of it has been set into motion now, at least we're examining the question. I've often had this, I mean, like you, I've done 11 years of international television in New York, and I somehow, watching last night, I really was wondering, like you, why I ever came back. This is and working with Indian television channels, I've noted that there is this, kind of race to get TRPs. Now, if somebody else is carrying a person of authority live, then we've got to cut to him live, whether we're interested in the subject or not, whether we happen to be, you could be a channel doing something entirely different. Now, to an extent, I can understand that. I don't accept it, but I can understand it to an extent with channels like Doordarshan or Rajya Sabha TV or Lok Sabha TV, because after all, the person who's funding those channels or the entity is the government of India. So to an extent, if they're reflecting, whatever the achievements of the party in power have been, whether it's the Congress, whether it's the BJP, then that to an extent, must be swallowed. But because in the interim, there are so many other channels. But what I don't absolutely get is that every single private channel behaves in exactly the same way. And it's one of the things that really turned me off working for an Indian television channel. To a large extent, not the editor's fault, not the journalist's fault. I think a lot has to do with, overall structures and who owns the channel and on what equation they are with the current dispensation.
I think what we need to examine, though, of course, is why this is happening. Why? And I think no one's getting to the bottom of why. Is it cultural, as Dilip argues? Is it the revenue model, as Ashutosh could speak to? Is it access, like I am suggesting? And the TRP that you speak about is actually we the people. If people rejected this kind of television, that TRP wouldn't exist. But look at what Trump said first, and this is his statement that network after network in America either refused to show, or at the end of it, this CNN anchor Anderson Cooper actually likened him to an obese turtle flailing in denial. I can't even imagine that kind of language being used for a powerful person. Let's listen in to what Trump said.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. If you count the votes that came in late, we're looking at them very strongly, but a lot of votes came in late. I've already decisively won many critical states, including massive victories in Florida, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio. To name just a few, we won these and many other victories despite historic election interference from big media, big money, and big tech. As everybody saw, we won by historic numbers. And the pollsters got it knowingly wrong. They got it knowingly wrong.
And at the end of this press conference, Fox News was among those that said that the president is lying. So, Anil, I want to try and understand why. I think all of us, all five of us have agreed this is the free media India can only dream of. Why? This is meant to be some shared value between the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy. Why is our media not free? Or why is our media not freer? I think that's the question that we need to address.
Well, one is, of course, what the book was talking about, cultural inheritance, in a sense, the way we've been brought up to respect hierarchy, to respect people in power, to respect the boss, and so on and so forth. And I think this goes through culturally. It's part of our I think being, the way we think. That's one. But second, and I think when it comes to media in India, and I think you can expand that not just to television, but to the press, the printed paper, which is much older. And let's go back to the emergency, for example, right? 1975, and what happened when we had what we thought was a vibrant press, and then Advani's famous words after the emergency ended. He said, "When you are asked to bow down, you crawled," or something to that effect. And it was very true. The censorship which was imposed during the emergency was fairly draconian, but hardly anyone tried to subvert it. Anyone tried to defy it. And so I'm saying this is kind of ingrained in our psyche, number one. Number two, it has a lot to do with the ownership of media. And in the West, I think when you are an owner of any media, whether you're an owner of a newspaper, it is incumbent on you. It is your duty to protect the freedom of the press, to have your own voice, to defy authority. It is an absolutely given that you will do it. It is not a question of should we or shouldn't we. If you don't do it, you get the hell out of it. You saw that film about the Washington Post, and they were taking a decision on whether to print. Was it the Watergate tapes? I forget the details now. Yes.
It was the Pentagon Papers. It was the Pentagon Papers, and yeah, it was called the movie was the Post.
The film talks about the way they arrived at the decision, how the owner, Catherine Graham, said finally that I don't care what happens to us, but this is something we just have to do. And would that happen here? No, because no owner thinks that it is important. We have a lot of our leading media houses shutting down papers, sacking editors. Ashutosh was saying that he hasn't worked under Modi, but I'm sure even if he was in Manmohan Singh's time, if he had cut off the prime minister in mid-flow, I think he would have been sacked the next day. And it's not that Manmohan Singh would have asked for it, but his owner would have done it. And I think that's the difference.
I think you've touched the hub of the matter, and let me take this to Ashutosh and then Dilip and Padma in that order. Ashutosh, I think we often condemn the government. Even in this case, we condemn, for example, the BJP government for being intolerant of the media. I actually think that courtiers are always more loyal than the king. Promoters are always looking over their shoulders. There's always the overcompensation. I'm not saying that political parties don't want to control media. I'm not saying that Mr. Modi has not had an adversarial relationship with the media. He clearly has. It's been there since Gujarat 2002. All of this is true. But do you really think, for example, that Mr. Amit Shah or Mr. Modi are calling the owners of TV networks and saying who can have a show and who cannot? Or do you think owners themselves are looking over their shoulder and saying, "Yeah, isko rakhenge to problem hoga"? Which one is it? I think we have to have that conversation more honestly.
See, Barkha, I think most of them are scared. Scared of losing revenues, scared of losing business, scared of TV station being shut. So there is a lot of scare. What Anil was saying, I partly agree with him. See, but the difference between Manmohan Singh regime and this regime is, which is very, 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 very stark, that during Manmohan Singh regime, you hardly used to get any diktat from the PMO. You have to carry this. Today, on a daily basis, this is programmed and this is planned. And it is told that Mr. Modi will be on this time, and so you have to carry this. Now, if there is a diktat from the PMO, how many of them can say, no, we will not carry that? During Manmohan Singh regime, I can say that, not that I want to contradict you and Dilip, but yes, we did cut Manmohan Singh's speech and many times, but we did not face any problem per se from the
But did
editors.
you do that? But did you do that when he was an already weakened prime minister in his second term, or did you do that in his first term? We also have to politically contextualize what's happening. By the end of UPA 2, the government was a beleaguered government. It was a government under siege. And the second thing is the way the Gandhis were treated with kid gloves, possibly by the media, was very different from how Manmohan Singh was treated. So I think we also have to recognize those differences, Ashu.
Barkha, yes, partly yes, but I could say that not only the IBN 7, but the many TV channels who used to cut Manmohan Singh in the middle, because he was so boring. He wasn't eyeball grabbing prime minister, and there was no pressure. There was no pressure from the PMO. Absolutely, there was no pressure from the Congress party. But yes, I agree that any statement from the Sonia Gandhi, we all used to take it very seriously, and we all used to weigh that whether how it should be carried. And I remember one incident only when the Sonia Gandhi has resigned, and I had just joined IBN 7 on the office of the Prophet case. And I said, Sonia Gandhi jo istifa, it's called majburi ka tyag. And immediately I got a call from somebody else was the owner of the channel, not the Raghav Bell others, not Network 18. And immediately I got a call and said, ki, isko aap hata sakte hain kya? So, it did happen. But the point here, what Dilip was talking about, the cultural thing, I just want to make a very small submission here. There is a difference between two newsrooms, CNN IBN newsroom and the IBN 7 newsroom. IBN's in the CNN IBN newsroom, any youngster could walk in and say, hi Rajdeep, how are you? What are you doing? But in IBN 7, if anybody could come to me and say, sir, he will wait for 5 minutes, 10 minutes to say a word. So it's a cultural difference. India is still in the semi-feudal society. It's not as evolved society, as evolved democracy as America is, where institutions are respected. Here, the people are respected, not the institution per se. So in America, when the Donald Trump became the president, the New York Times, Washington Post, all the TV channels, they started telling him that you are not the best president this country should have. And the quarrel started from the day one. It did not start in India per se.
Yeah, fair enough. But I want to just, Padma, give me a second, because something very interesting that Ashutosh said, I want to take to Dilip, and then I'll come to you. About Manmohan Singh being boring, right? It goes back to Padma's point about TRPs. Now, one of the things that the American media has had a lot of hand-wringing about is that in his first term, there was a lot of airspace given to Trump, because whatever else he is, he's not boring. He is compelling, he's crazy. And that is why he is absolutely compelling to watch. People watch in morbid fascination. And then the media started getting shat upon, especially by liberals and progressives, saying, you are giving this man unfettered space, uncritical space, just because you want ratings, right? So, Dilip, I think there's also that point of who's boring, who's complex, who gets you the eyeballs, who doesn't get you the eyeballs. There's all of that going on as well, right?
It ties in very neatly with this TRP issue, because if you start measuring news channels on the same measurement metric as entertainment channels, then you need a buffoon to occupy that space, or you need somebody who's hysterical and he's actually providing, or she is providing, entertainment. So that's one part. But I think that the Donald Trump airtime issue is on one side. But the bigger aspect, to my mind, is the fact that we are all refusing to discuss the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that owners know that there are costs. The cost can be revenue, which you talked about already. The cost can be of that dreaded phone call from a party apart chick. But the worst is that you could have a knock from one of the agencies. So the owners know that they have to be much more loyal, much more sensitive than the king is to preempt the possibility of any of this. So that training and that weakening of institutions all around is what has resulted in this atmosphere of fear. So the fear we are talking about is here because you know that there are ways for anyone sitting in an office, and it can be as lowly an office as the principal secretary to a chief minister of a state, who has his means or her means of getting at you if you are the owner of a media channel there. So
Yeah. You're right. And can I just ask you to add a sentence and then I want Padma to respond? Actually, it's the structure of capitalism, both how power and money is arranged in our country. That's what we actually need to address, because in the United States of America, Amazon, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, but his business will not be impacted by what the paper publishes because the government does not have that kind of power over Amazon. In
Absolutely.
India, if there was a big business house that owned a big paper, other businesses could be impacted. And that is really the elephant in the room. We have too much government. We have too much government in business, and so we have too much government in media.
Because also government does not distinguish between the Amazon structure and the Washington Post structure, because they say this is Bezos ka kaam, which is partially the hierarchy. Malik wahi to hai. So the idea of a publicly listed company, ownership not being consequential because you have a promoter, etc., is not the issue. Here, the attack is on you as the owner, and therefore it's not on the corporation, it's not on your extended companies, it's on you.
Right.
I'll
Padma,
stop here.
yeah, thanks, Dilip. That's very, very interesting. Padma, there's a comment on the screen. And since Anil referred and referenced the Post, the movie, Alan Babu says Woodward and Bernstein would be in jail if they were Indians, referring, of course, to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who broke the story of the Pentagon Papers, right? This is the level of cynicism among our people, yet our people don't seem to demand a different kind of media, nor do they seem to be willing to pay for it. Which is why we end up depending on business houses. Business houses in turn are depending on governments. Governments aren't going to set business free. Until private business is free, private media will not be free. I actually see a direct linkage.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say that Bernstein and co would be arrested in India, because to be fair to our, some of our very senior journalists, whom I won't name just now, but during the emergency era, there were a lot of people who stepped forward and who actually came forth and, and took a stand. So there was, in fact, that brings me to two points that I've been waiting to make. One is that, the media was free in India to a great extent, given the factors of respect and, respect for elders and respect for authority, which Dilip mentioned. I think things changed when the social media came and television came in, because of the sheer effect of television and the sheer effect of the social media on such a visual crazy society and such an emotionally high-strung society that we are. Now, the United States is very similar in that respect, but all kinds of other things play a role, demographic differences between the United States and India and all that sort of thing. So I think that this potentially explosive effect that the social media and television can have made a big difference in what the media is putting out, and also the way the media is being perceived by those in authority as well as the general public. It's almost as if at times when there's an explosive story, the general public is standing by to get its cues from either the pictures or the what the anchor is saying on television. The other point I'd like to make is that this whole thing about editorial space being given, for instance, this is really something that has grown exponentially in India, and I find it a little disturbing that as and when somebody in power wants editorial space for either an editorial or wants to come on and have a message on television or something like that, it's always granted, irrespective of what you're going to chuck out. If you have perhaps a more important comment, perhaps there's an ongoing story which you're covering, all that takes a backseat when it's a question of somebody pick the phone ringing and asking for editorial space. This I find very objectionable. The other third point is there's been a polarization, Barkha, and we've got to admit this, in the media, whether in the United States or here. Now, I mean, we're talking about the remarks that were made by the television anchors yesterday after Trump went off. And certainly, for us sitting so far away, now we have to ask ourselves, all of us here, sitting here in the studio, have to ask ourselves this question: if we had a media organization that went cut away from somebody, who's speaking, and then made some derogatory remarks about that person, how are we going to absorb it as a people, given our own sort of psychology and given our own mental makeup and psychological makeup? This is a question that we have to seriously ask ourselves. And a last point, this boring, unpredictable stuff, that Dilip was talking about. I agree with Dilip that Dr. Manmohan Singh, yes, he doesn't make good television, if you like, and Trump, I agree with you, makes terrific television because he's unpredictable and you never know what he's going to say. And I think that is something that is also extremely, that the Indian viewing public is very interested in. We want tamasha, we want action, we want masala, we don't want something or someone boring, even if it's. But however, having said that, were Dr. Manmohan Singh to go on air and issue a statement or issue a remark, and quite frankly speaking, I mean, to be fair to Mr. Modi, his Mann Ki Baat, which he does, this is a column, if you like, a visual column which he had announced right in the beginning. Now, what I object to are the private television stations cutting, back and forth to everything that a prime minister or a president utters or says. And Dr. Manmohan Singh. Sorry, just very quickly, the only thing I'd like to say is that if it is a question of a national emergency, or if there's been a natural calamity or something like that, where a prime minister or a president needs to go on air immediately and address the nation, so to speak, I think we should be able to live with that. But anything that goes beyond that, this kind of proprietary use of editorial space.
This officially, yes. But I think the interesting point that you touched upon, and I want the others to respond to it, is the polarization. So, Ashu, I have on my screen what Anderson Cooper said when he likened Trump to an obese, fleeing turtle in denial. Now, actually, I have to say that though I envy the American media, I would not personally talk like this about anybody because it's just not me, right? It's not me. I do believe that there is a certain sort of framework that we are bound by. Otherwise, we are like trolls. Otherwise, we are not journalists, we're like trolls, right? So it's one thing to fact check your president or your prime minister. It's another thing to use this kind of language. So one, do you think that CNN just hates Trump? Because that's what will be said, that they'd never talk like this about Biden. So I think we have to address the elephant in the room, which is about polarization.
See, Barkha, I think it's more of a culture specific or more of a language specific in that sense. And again, I'll go back to comparing the CNN IBN newsroom and the IBN 7 newsroom, and how many times the Rajdeep used to use the word F in a news discussion. And if I had used that kind of language in my newsroom and with my team, so I would have been lynched by there only. So it's something we have to make a distinction. If you watch all these Hollywood movies, how many times the F word are used so often today in the OTT platforms, when these M and other words are used, now the whole world is shocked and saying, ये किस तरीके की भाषा का इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, ये तो पूरी संस्कृति बर्बाद कर दी, चौपट कर दी है. So I think in the American environment, I think these are taken words. People don't mind saying something like this because they don't take it to their heart. But in our context, especially in the language context, in the vernacular context, it is taken more seriously. अरे इसने तो मुझे माँ की गाली दे दी. और so I used to say, Rajdeep, please don't come to this room and use this F word. Otherwise, what will happen? I and you both will be lynched. So I think in that context, it should be taken. If we can avoid, good enough. But if that question has to be asked to the CNN's anchor more truly.
No, I'm just saying polarization. I think there's the questions that are coming up about polarization. I'll take it to Dilip first, then Anil, and then you, Padma. Dilip, go ahead.
The fact is that the polarization of America has been the subject of two rather exceptionally good works in recent times to delineate the extent to which that polarization has been there and has got exacerbated under Trump. So that is something that is, without a doubt, one of the reasons for this. But the second thing is that why are we discussing Anderson Cooper's comment? Because he hasn't made a comment like that over the last 4 years. So the fact that he's gone out there and said this now is an indication of the extent of his anger about trying to mess with the fundamental process of the elections. So I think that in some senses, also the second thing is that Trump, who is looking defeated or like the turtle on his back, is actually not great television because he's now suddenly beginning to look pathetic. So there is that fact that he's no longer the kind of engaging television he was providing just 5 days ago. There's a sea of a difference in his body language, in the level of interest in watching him, because suddenly he's looking sad and beaten, and that's, I think that is what provokes.
He's basically yesterday's story, and I think at the point that
right.
Ashu says that we were starting to tune out Manmohan Singh had become yesterday's story. I think basically we have to acknowledge that the media is essentially today's story and tomorrow's story. It is not giving space to yesterday's story. But Anil, yes. I think we still haven't addressed polarization. Polarization is a driving force for what the media will do, who it will tune out, and who it will never tune out. If you want to take that, Anil.
Polarization is, what does it actually mean? It means taking sides, right? Now, I think traditionally all media has taken sides depending on their worldview. If you take, let's say the British press, which I know reasonably well, the Telegraph has always been known to be conservative. The Guardian has always been known to be left-leaning, and so on down the line. So it's very difficult for media outlets, whether there's TV or newspapers or whatever, to be completely neutral. There is a built-in bias, which is not necessarily a bad bias, but a leaning, which the reader also expects. The person who reads The Guardian is not going to buy the Telegraph, and vice versa, right? And these lines will be kept right through. But what has happened now with the kind of leaders that are there in the world, like Trump, but also there's Berlusconi in Italy, the Hungarian leader, and so on. These are extreme examples of people who will divide a country. Now, when that happens, that shows itself, reflects itself in the media as well. And with Trump particularly, the example you gave, is because I think the media is now so damn fed up with it. And when the leader of Iran quotes Trump and saying this election is a fraud, and the leader of Iran says, this is the president of the United States talking about his election process. This is what a democracy is, ha, ha, ha. So now the leader of America is making his own election process a laughingstock of the world and giving fodder to the enemy kind of thing. That's why they're fed up, I think. But polarization will always exist, whether it exists in an extreme form or it will exist in the form of taking sides, ideological sides. I think it's going to continue.
This is very interesting because you're actually saying that the media is not going to be objective. The objectivity is a kind of myth. And Padma, you're wanting to comment to that. And I think let's start taking comments on that as we wind up. If we are saying that we're all going to have our own biases, and that includes political opinions. Now, in America, for example, people are either registered to be Democrats or Republicans or independents. So it's actually not difficult to know where the leaning of a particular journalist lies, because you can be registered and anyone can find out. It's accessible information. We do not have a two-party system. We are not politically the same.
Well, Barkha, in the interim, I'd like to say that it's very easy to find out, even in India and as in the United States, as to which side which journalist is on the moment they come on, a television screen or you see their name in a column. Just two quick points, to polarization. I agree with Anil to an extent, that, however, what I find is not entirely true. I mean, as a journalist, what I object to most respectfully is that to be non-polarized and to be neutral and to take a very central stance in what you report is the ABC. It's journalism 101. That's what you were taught. That's what I was taught. That's what Ashutosh was taught. That's what Dilip was taught. So I think that to follow that tenet and to keep, steer clear, or to stay on that course, I think that should be what all journalists should be really, trying for. And the other thing is that what I find objectionable to polarization is that even when somebody does something good, I mean, assuming that in the United States, you're a Republican voter and you have a Democrat president, it is simply not journalism and it is not kosher to veer from that path just to either stay silent on something that's been done, which is commendable, which is actually to be commended, or criticize it illogically. So I find that is, and a very last thing to what Ashutosh said about Hindi channels. I agree with him. I think there's a huge, difference between the quality even of what Hindi channels are actually transmit and what English channels do. That goes beyond the newsroom and just. But I think to come back to what you were saying, I think the difference between what Ashutosh was pointing out about the F word and what you were saying is, how it disturbed you and it disturbed me to an extent. We were uncomfortable with what was said about Trump. Is that I think what we're referring to is decorum. It's decorum. There is something known as decorum, and I think no matter how insightful and how centered your journalism is, or how sharply critical your journalism is, there is always room and place for decorum.
I would agree with that for the simple reason that the host is meant to be different from the politician, right? So the politician is expected to be badly behaved. The host is not expected to respond in kind, right? But I think to go to polarization, Manika Ghosh's comment, polarization is something one does not expect from media. Slight bias may have always existed, but today's media is like a mouthpiece of one or the other party, which is sad. Ashutosh, in Hindi, I call this ya chamcha ya morcha. कि भारत का जो मीडिया है वो या चमचा है या मोर्चा है. And there is almost no middle ground at all. And the middle ground is reviled by both sides. If there's one thing that the left and the right in India at least have in common, it's to mock people who refuse to self-identify as either left or right. Ashu?
Yes, absolutely.
See, Barkha, I think we have to understand one thing. In the Indian context, I think the right of the center media is a new thing. Right of the center media has been in England and the America and the European countries, but it's something which is very, very new. So it is shocking for many of us who belong to the liberal left or to the middle ground or the centrist. So, but the problem with the right of the center media is that when you start manipulating facts, journalism is journalism. The information is sacrosanct. Whether you belong to the left of the media or the right of the media, you are not supposed to play with facts. You are not supposed to manipulate facts. You are not supposed to play fake news. I think the right of the center media in this country has taken their position too seriously, or they have gone beyond the realm of journalism, and that's where the problem lies. I have no problem reading the Hindu newspaper. It's a left of the center media, but I know that the facts given in the Hindu newspaper is not manipulated. They might have a different viewpoint. Like right of the center media will take very seriously, will be very critical of the human rights issues. But the left of the center media will take human rights issue as a very important part of the democracy. So if we quarrel on that, I think probably we will be committing mistakes somewhere. I think the right of the center media should talk about the national security, and the left of the center media should talk about the democratic rights and the human rights. But if left of the center media and the right of the center media, if they start playing with the words, if they start becoming the propagandists, only then the problem is there.
Okay, Padma, quickly you want to respond? Then
Very
Dilip?
quickly, very quickly. With all due respect, I think Ashutosh is a fantastic journalist and I've always admired his work. But Ashutosh, this kind of playing around with words and this kind of tampering with the truth is not restricted to those who are right of center or journalists who support right of center. I think it's an affliction, it's a disease, it's a pandemic in the Indian media as well as I think in most, in many sections of the Western media. So I think basically we have to stick to that tenet as we keep saying, and as we've said during the show. It doesn't matter what your political leanings are.
Yeah.
When you are at your keyboard and you're facing the camera and you're reporting on something, stay true to your story. That is what you've signed that invisible oath of journalism for.
But my question is, what if you are neither left nor right? Today, Dilip, for the polarized times we live in, it would be called sitting on the fence. It would be called not having a spine. It would be called not standing up for anything. But the journalism that we were taught did not, in fact, teach us to take these sides. This is an expectation of a new politics and of a new audience. And for people who live in television and the digital world, it is particularly difficult because people are looking for confirmation bias when they come to you. And if you do not confirm their bias, they call you biased.
The fact is that in a polarized world, if you are in the center, you're boring and you don't have a following. That's one. The second thing is that why are we so polarized? The answer to that lies in the rise, both in India and in the United States, of identity politics in the last 10 years. So, this identity politics is again an elephant in the room which we are not discussing because these identities have felt threatened either for good reason or because some kind of media has come out and told them you have every right to feel threatened, to feel spat upon, and therefore rise up and establish your identity. Journalism's job is, I think, to go a little beyond the he said, she said kind of journalism and to see the patterns of those who are provoking this kind of identity politics into the politics of violence, into the politics of hate, into the politics of partisanship and extreme, polarization. So I think that unless journalists do one more level beyond the fact checking, they will also have to see what is good for the longer term sustenance, survival, whatever it is, of societal values which are one level above identity politics.
But Dilip, what therefore is a journalist's job? Suppose the head of a state has a press conference. Are you saying you're comfortable with the idea of tuning out? I'm actually not. I envy what the American media did, but I wouldn't have done it. What I mean by that is, I wouldn't have cut out. I would have definitely fact checked. I would have fact checked him, but I wouldn't have censored him. I just think they're two completely different things. He's the president of the United States. He's having a press conference. He's making a bunch of claims, right? So you can see a clear political response in the media as well. Let's not deny that. Ashok, briefly,
I don't think so.
You don't agree? You don't agree? Dilip?
I don't think so. No, I
Why
don't
not?
think so.
Why not? Why not?
I think that a whole bunch of fact checking has happened for the last several months on what the Biden camp has been saying and what Trump has been saying. Now, what happened was, I think pulling out of that press conference was a decision by not one channel, two channels, but three channels, because they figured out that he was actually spewing stuff which was going to be extremely divisive. So the divisive nature of what he was going to say is what prompted them to say, we need to preserve something. They were taking a judgment. In our newsrooms, we would have said, whatever he says is news, so let's carry it.
That's right. I agree.
Not recognizing that whatever he says, the moment he says that, is provocation for a whole bunch of people carrying automatic weapons and riding around and wanting to enforce what he has signaled to them. So, in a sense, is he saying stand down or is he saying stand up? So that was the danger that they were worried about.
You're right. You're right. That sensibility in the Indian newsroom कि जो कुछ बोलता है वो न्यूज है. Ashutosh, it also has to do with the fact that Indian newsrooms are not generating enough original content. There's very little reporting happening. It's very talk driven. It's very studio oriented driven. Everybody's looking for cheap and free content, and therefore press conferences by heads of state are cheap and free content, right? Isn't that also part of the problem, to be completely honest?
See, Indian television has completely changed. It is no longer input driven. It is output driven.
Yes.
People in the morning when the edit meetings are happening, so every producer will come up. I'll make show on this, I'll make show on this, and you reporter, you go and collect this bite, you go and collect that bite, that kind of a thing. See, on this Donald Trump issue, I have a slightly different viewpoint. See, these TV channels, they did not cut Donald Trump day before, when at 2:30 in the night he almost said the same thing. He said it's a fraud he called the American election as a fraud. None of these TV channels they did cut. Probably they knew he might come back as a president, but 2 days when it became very clear that now he's losing and the Biden is maybe the next president, then they came out. What did not shock me that they cut the transmission. What shocked me was the comment made by these anchors and the TV studios when they had the gumption to say he is lying, he is not truthful. I think that is what required more courage, more conviction than cutting the transmission in between.
I think you're absolutely right to fact check a head of state. Anil, and then Anil's been waiting, Padma, so I'll come to you right after Anil. Anil, go ahead. Yeah.
When we look at polarization, I think it has a lot to do with the leadership in the country. If you go back to, let's say, Rajiv Gandhi, Manmohan Singh, Nehru, or before that, if you go to the US, under Clinton, Obama, and so on, there was not that kind of polarization, simply because the leadership did not take extreme positions. So when the leadership, political leadership, takes extreme positions on whatever, ideological extreme positions, I think the media has to respond in some way. If Trump is going to talk about building a wall to stop immigrants, if he's going to stop healthcare, if he's going to allow the proliferation of arms and guns and so on, or he's saying that the global warming is a big hoax, etc. Now, these are extreme positions. Now, how do you counter them by being quiet and sensible? You have to respond in kind, almost. And this is what is happening in India. The leadership has taken extreme ideological positions. Now, if we had the guts, we would counter it in an extreme way. We've already gone into why our media doesn't do so. But what I'm saying is that the media is driven by what the leadership does in taking these positions. Now, should it, or can it stand apart, aloof, and say, we'll look at it objectively and comment on it? That is, I think, a big question.
We have to start taking last comments. We've got about 6 minutes left on the show, but I think Anil made a very, very important point, which is that extreme politics will drive in extreme media. And so while it is shocking to us that Cooper spoke like this, he is responding to an extreme president.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important point, that extreme decisions, for example, let's take some of the government's extreme decisions, demonetization, the citizenship legislation bill, the abrogation of 370, whether you agree with it or not, they are extreme decisions. So should there be an extreme media response, Padma?
Just to go back to what Anil said, I agree. What I want to say is that the quality of political rhetoric has deteriorated drastically. Barkha, as you know, we've all been covering, from Gungi Gudiya and Khoon Ke Saudagar and Parkati Aurat and God knows what else has been. All kinds of abusive and slightly less abusive language is being used freely and with impunity by the political classes. And I think those very political classes that people sort of looked up to as your ideals, and this this is a hangover of the independence era, where we looked up to these people as those who gave us our freedom. That has dissipated over the years. So I agree with Anil that the quality, what we're saying and doing on television screens pretty much reflects what our politicians are saying. And Trump, I just a point about people cutting away from Trump yesterday. To add to what Ashutosh was saying, yes, it was obvious that it's becoming increasingly or slowly obvious that he may not be the winner. But the other thing was that much of what he said in the second half, he was almost rambling, and almost babbling and almost repeating over and over again the very invalid points that he had already started with, about recount and this, that, and the other. So I think at that stage, they took an editorial decision to simply cut away to something more interesting, which is not a repetitive comment. And you are absolutely right. I think their whole focus should now be to take those observations apart. Were votes really being fudged? Were they not? And many of them have done that. So overall, we are very similar to the United States in many ways. But the whole the purpose of this show is at the center of this, and the center of this discussion is very, it's you've brought it, to an absolute point. It is true that we are, we have reached a level where we have almost no freedom or almost no authority left even to pursue that central line of journalism that we aspire to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the comment on the screen sums up everybody's view. I think the press should not censor a leader, but should broadcast the speech and then tell us it's a lie if it is. Right? The problem, Ashutosh, is that we do not necessarily do that either with the head of state. We do not do it. We do not do it. I do not remember a culture of Indian newsrooms where any head of state speaks, and right after that, in real time, the head of state is being fact-checked.
I think you did journalism in a different era altogether. Now the time has completely changed. See, I want to make a very different point in the sense, because the kind of polarization we hear about, the kind of divisiveness we hear about, and the kind of word and the languages come back to us. I think it's all because of the television, also because in 1991, when this Ayodhya movement was happening, the word was equally polarized, but those words were not coming through television to us. So in subconscious mind, we probably were more divisive at that point of time. But now, when you switch on the television, we hear those words. So those words suddenly become a big words. It's like what I remember when the Farid Zakaria has said that the 21st century is probably the least violent society. But when we open the television, when the 6th person has been killed, it looks like that the 6 million people has been killed, and the 21st century is the most violent century. So I think this word divisiveness, this word abusiveness, all this had always been in our society. But because of the television, now the echo is so much that we have started believing that the word has become very, very divisive and unlivable.
So basically, you're saying that TV makes it seem worse than it actually is. Anil, a quick comment, and then Dilip can have the last word. Yeah, Anil.
I think one point we are forgetting is that when Trump was speaking, he's not just the president, but he's actually a candidate for presidency now. So he and Biden are both candidates. And if one candidate is speaking untruths and telling lies about the electoral process, I think you have a right to stop him. So let's not look at it as the president being stopped, but as a candidate being stopped from making false statements. I think that's a very important point to note. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is an important distinction. But Dilip, I actually think that in our elections, even candidates are not fact-checked. There's something about the rigor of journalism that has gone away from our newsrooms. And if candidates are criticized, it's from a very political prism. So, for example, you will have today an Op India digital platform that will have one view of the world. You will have Wire, which will have another view of the world. I'm not comparing them journalistically. I'm just saying their affiliations or their leanings or what they feel about politics is sort of well known. And then you will have a Rahul Gandhi, Modi going at each other, let's say in a campaign. You'll just have TV covering it in a he said way. Where is the rigor of analysis, of reporting, of fact-checking, of data journalism? And is the problem a lack of courage, or is it a lack of money, or is it both?
I think it is a lack of both. Courage in larger measure than resources, because if you have the courage, you will find some of the resources to put to it. So it's really a combination of both. But I want to come back to the point of leadership and the point of polarization. When you have this new breed of leaders who have got to power on the basis of the fact that they have played identity politics of whatever kind, then naturally they themselves at the leadership level have a vested interest in keeping society polarized, and therefore media tends to also get polarized. So partially it is a response of one to the other as a result of a previous thing, which is a leader wanting to choose that route, which means that we no longer have statesmen, but we have politicians who cynically know how to exploit the existing identity caste lines for their winnability. So that is what Trump has done, and that is, I think, what is coming through now in the nature of what is American elections.
Well, I have to leave it there, but I will say that Trump brought politics to an inflection point. But the American media has displayed one thing, no matter what else you think of it, it is truly a free media. There is something about their institutional freedom that is enviable and that we as journalists have a lot to learn from. I hope promoters who own platforms feel inspired by what they've seen happening in the United States of America. Leaving it there, Dilip, Ashutosh, Anil, and Padma, and to our audience, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow evening with